Imagine waking up one morning and finding that your neighbor has vanished. Then your teacher, then your doctor, then your children's friends. Imagine that within a single year, nearly every educated person you know has been taken, arrested, executed, or simply gone. Now imagine that the man responsible was not some foreign invader. He was born in your country. He ate the same rice. He walked the same dusty roads. And for years he smiled and told everyone he was building a better world. What kind of person could look into the eyes of 2 million innocent people and order them to die? What kind of ideology turns a classroom into a killing ground? And how does an entire nation let it happen? His name was Pol Pot, and the story of what he did to Cambodia is one of the most terrifying chapters in all of human history. Not because he was a monster from some distant land, but because he truly believed he was a hero. That belief made him more dangerous than anything the world had ever seen. In the mid-1970s, a small country in Southeast Asia almost completely disappeared from the modern world. Not because of a natural disaster, not because of a foreign army, but because its own government decided that modernity itself was the enemy. Cambodia, a nation of gentle rice farmers, ancient temples, and centuries of quiet civilization. A place where Buddhism was woven into the very soul of daily life. A country that, by all accounts, should have been left alone to find its own peace after decades of colonial rule and war. But something changed. A small group of men, educated in the universities of Paris, returned home with ideas that would turn paradise into a graveyard. They called themselves the Khmer Rouge, the Red Khmers. And their leader, the man who sat at the very center of their terrifying revolution, chose to hide behind a name that few people would ever know until it was too late. Pol Pot. Here is what we don't know yet. Why would a man who loved French poetry and fine cheese choose to destroy everything modern? How did a shy, quiet student become the architect of one of the worst genocides the 20th century ever produced? And most haunting of all, how did millions of ordinary Cambodians become both the victims and the instruments of their own destruction? The answers are darker than you expect, and they start long before the killing ever began. Ambud. To understand Pol Pot, you first have to understand Cambodia. And to understand Cambodia, you have to go back to a time when it was not even called Cambodia at all. For centuries, the Khmer people had built one of the greatest empires in Southeast Asia. The temples of Angkor Wat still stand today as proof. Massive, magnificent, carved out of jungle stone by a civilization that rivaled anything in medieval Europe. At its peak, the Khmer Empire controlled most of what is now Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam. But empires fall. And by the 19th century, Cambodia had shrunk. It was weak, surrounded by more powerful neighbors who wanted its land. And in 1863, France moved in. Cambodia became a French protectorate. The Khmers, once the greatest power in the region, were now subjects of a distant European colonial government. French colonialism left deep scars. The Cambodians were treated as lesser people. Their culture was studied but not respected. Their economy was exploited. Their political voice was silenced. And yet, something unexpected happened. France brought schools and universities, and some Cambodians, the children of wealthy families, were sent to study in Paris. This is where everything begins to go wrong. But something changed during those Paris years. The young Cambodian students were not just studying French literature and engineering. They were absorbing radical ideas, Marxism, communism. The belief that society had to be torn down and rebuilt from zero, that the workers and the peasants were the true heart of any nation, and that the educated elite, the wealthy, the colonizers, were parasites who had to be destroyed. In Paris, these ideas were exciting, philosophical, debated over coffee and cigarettes in comfortable cafes. But some of these students carried those ideas back home. And in Cambodia, surrounded by poverty and colonial humiliation and the long memory of ancient Khmer greatness, those ideas did not stay philosophical for long. They became a plan. What happened next was worse than anyone who stayed safely in Paris could have imagined. Cambodia gained independence from France in 1953 under the leadership of a royal figure named Prince Norodom Sihanouk. For a time, there was peace. But Southeast Asia was changing fast. The Vietnam War was spreading, the Americans were bombing, the communists were rising, and Cambodia, sitting directly in the middle of this storm, could not stay neutral no matter how hard it tried. By the late 1960s, the Khmer Rouge, the radical communist group that had been quietly growing in the Cambodian jungle, was ready to make its move. They had been waiting, training, recruiting poor peasants who resented the city, the wealthy, the educated, the foreign, and at the head of this movement, still hiding his true name from the world, was the man who would soon change everything. His real name was Salith Sar. He was born in 1925 in a small village in central Cambodia. His family was not poor. In fact, they had royal connections. His cousin was a dancer in the royal palace. His brother worked in the palace administration. From the very beginning, Salith Sar had advantages that most Cambodians could only dream of. He was described by people who knew him as a boy as gentle, soft-spoken, even shy. He liked music. He was not aggressive or violent. There was nothing in his early years that would suggest he would one day become one of the most brutal dictators in history. Nothing except the ideas that would slowly, quietly take root in his mind. He went to Paris in 1949 to study radio electronics on a scholarship. He was a poor student. He failed his exams, but he had extraordinary social skills. He was charming, warm. He made people feel at ease. In Paris, he fell in with Cambodian communist students and became deeply involved in their discussions, their reading groups, their political dreams. He returned to Cambodia in 1953 without a degree, but he brought something far more dangerous than a diploma. He brought a vision. Back in Cambodia, he became a teacher, a quiet, beloved teacher who was remembered by his students as kind and thoughtful. He taught French literature. He wrote political essays, and in secret he was building a movement. But the real truth was that Salith Sar had already begun to transform himself into something else. He adopted the name Pol Pot, a name deliberately vague, deliberately anonymous. He moved into the jungle. He organized the Khmer Rouge. And he developed a political vision so extreme, so absolute, that even other communist leaders around the world would eventually be horrified by it. Pol Pot's ideology was unique. Most communist movements wanted to industrialize, to modernize, to build factories and cities and make the working class powerful in an urban world. Pol Pot wanted the opposite. He believed that the city was corrupt, that money was corrupt, that education made people arrogant and disconnected from the true Khmer spirit. He wanted to erase modernity entirely and return Cambodia to what he called Year Zero. A blank slate, a pure agrarian society with no cities, no schools, no currency, no private property, and no connection to the outside world. It sounds like madness, and it was. But to the poor farmers of rural Cambodia, who had been exploited by the wealthy and bombed by the Americans and ignored by the royal government, the message had a terrifying appeal. This educated man who lived in the jungle with them, who ate what they ate and wore the same black clothes, was telling them that they were the true Khmers, that they were the heroes, that the people in the cities were the enemies. He was building an army, and he was building it out of the poorest, most angry, most desperate people in the country. Many of them were barely teenagers, some were children, and Pol Pot knew exactly what he was doing. Young people without education, without memory, without connection to the old world, would be the most loyal soldiers imaginable. Early signs were already visible. Villages near Khmer Rouge territory reported disappearances. People who questioned the group's ideology were executed quietly. Discipline in the Khmer Rouge was absolute and brutal. But the world was not paying attention. The world was focused on Vietnam. By the early 1970s, Cambodia was falling apart, and the collapse was happening on multiple fronts at once. On one side, there was the Vietnam War spilling over the border. The Americans were secretly bombing Cambodian territory to destroy North Vietnamese supply routes. These bombing campaigns were devastating. Entire villages were wiped out. Hundreds of thousands of Cambodians were killed or displaced. The countryside was traumatized, and every bomb that fell pushed more angry, grieving Cambodians toward the Khmer Rouge. On another front, Cambodia's own government was crumbling. In 1970, while Prince Sihanouk was traveling abroad, a military general named Lon Nol took power in a coup backed by the Americans. The new government was corrupt, incompetent, and deeply unpopular. It struggled to fight the Khmer Rouge and the North Vietnamese at the same time. Inflation was destroying the economy. The military was losing battles. Ordinary people were suffering. And in the jungle, Pol Pot was watching all of this with intense satisfaction. The chaos was perfect for him. Every American bomb was a recruiting tool. Every corrupt government official was proof that the old system had to die. Every hungry farmer who lost his rice field to war became a potential soldier for year zero. The Khmer Rouge grew from a few thousand fighters to tens of thousands. Then hundreds of thousands. Something else was happening too. Pol Pot was quietly beginning to purge his own movement. Even within the Khmer Rouge, anyone who seemed too educated, too independent, or too connected to Vietnam was suspected of being a traitor. Secret executions happened in the jungle. Loyalty was tested constantly. A culture of fear and paranoia was already forming at the very heart of the revolution before it had even won. But the real truth was that Pol Pot was not building a political movement. He was building a cult in which he was the invisible, all-knowing leader. He was so secretive that for years most of his own followers did not know what he looked like. He was known only as Brother Number One. And then everything shifted. In April 1975, the Khmer Rouge marched into Phnom Penh, Cambodia's capital city. The Lon Nol government collapsed. Soldiers who had been fighting for the old regime threw their weapons on the ground. The war was over. The Khmer Rouge had won. For one brief moment, some people thought it might mean peace. Some city residents came out to watch the Khmer Rouge soldiers march in. They were curious. Some were even relieved that the fighting was over. They had no idea what was coming next. Within hours of capturing Phnom Penh, Pol Pot gave an order that shocked even people who thought they understood the Khmer Rouge. He ordered the complete evacuation of the city. Every single person in Phnom Penh, nearly 2 million people, was told to leave immediately. No exceptions. Hospitals emptied their patients onto the streets. Sick people, people who had just had surgery, people connected to IVs and breathing machines, were pushed out into the brutal heat. Old people, pregnant women, babies, all of them were ordered to walk. The Khmer Rouge soldiers went door to door, street to street, with rifles and megaphones. Leave immediately. The Americans are going to bomb the city. Leave and you will be safe. It was a lie. There were no American bombs coming. But millions of people believed it because they had just spent years living through actual American bombings. The roads out of Phnom Penh became rivers of humanity. People walked with whatever they could carry. Children cried. Elderly people fell and could not get up. Those who moved too slowly were beaten or shot. Thousands died on those roads in the first few days. This was not a military evacuation. This was the beginning of Year Zero. Pol Pot believed that cities were the source of all corruption. Phnom Penh, with its markets and restaurants and schools and hospitals and connections to the outside world, represented everything he wanted to destroy. By emptying it, he was not just solving a military problem, he was erasing the modern world. Similar scenes played out across Cambodia. Every town, every city was emptied. People were marched into the countryside and assigned to work in agricultural communes. The word commune makes it sound organized. It was not. It was slave labor on collective farms with starvation-level food rations, brutal overseers, and death for anyone who complained. The Khmer Rouge had a word for the people who came from the cities. They called them new people. And in the ideology of Year Zero, new people were less than fully human. They were contaminated by the old world. They had to be re-educated or eliminated. Cambodia had just been turned into a giant outdoor prison. And the warden was brother number one. What happened next inside Cambodia was almost impossible to comprehend. The Khmer Rouge did not just reorganize society, they tried to delete it entirely. Money was abolished. Overnight, all currency was worthless. Banks were not just closed, they were blown up. The Khmer Rouge literally dynamited the National Bank of Cambodia, because Pol Pot believed money was a symbol of everything evil about the old world. In its place, everyone would work and everyone would receive their share of food. In theory. In practice, people starved while Khmer Rouge cadres ate. Schools were closed. Universities were shut down. Teachers were considered dangerous enemies of the revolution. Wearing glasses was enough to get you killed, because glasses suggested you spend time reading instead of farming, and that made you an intellectual, and intellectuals were enemies. Doctors, lawyers, engineers, artists, monks, former soldiers, all were targets. Many were executed outright. Others were sent to labor camps where they were worked until they died. The goal was not just to kill these people. It was to destroy the idea that specialized knowledge had any value. Under Year Zero, everyone was equal, and equal meant equally ignorant, equally obedient, and equally terrified. Religion was another target. Cambodia was a deeply Buddhist country. Pol Pot hated that. Religion was a form of authority that competed with his own. He ordered the mass destruction of temples. Monks were forced to leave their monasteries. Some were executed. Religious practice became punishable by death. But something changed when you look at who was doing the killing. The executioners were often very young, teenagers, some barely old enough to hold the rifles and machetes they were given. Pol Pot had deliberately recruited and indoctrinated these children precisely because they had no memory of the old world, no education that might make them question orders, and no emotional attachments to the communities they were assigned to control. They were instruments of a system designed by adults who never had to look their victims in the eye. The killing fields were real places, holes dug in the ground outside cities and villages where people were brought at night, beaten or stabbed, not shot because bullets were too expensive, and buried. The Khmer Rouge kept careful records. They photographed their victims before killing them. These records survived, and they are among the most disturbing documents in the history of human violence. Tuol Sleng, a former high school in Phnom Penh that the Khmer Rouge converted into a secret prison called S21, held between 17,000 and 20,000 people during the 4 years of Pol Pot's rule. Of those, only 7 are known to have survived. The rest were tortured until they confessed to imaginary crimes, then transported to the killing fields and murdered. The stakes kept rising because the purges did not stop with the general population. Pol Pot began turning on his own people. Inside the Khmer Rouge, paranoia was consuming everything. Pol Pot was convinced that his revolution was being infiltrated by CIA agents, Vietnamese spies, and traitors at every level. Mass purges of Khmer Rouge officials began. Regional commanders who had been loyal fighters for years were suddenly arrested, taken to S21, tortured into confessions, and executed. Then the people who had arrested them were arrested. Then the people who arrested those people. The revolution was eating itself, and the country was disappearing with it. Oh my, Pambird. By 1978, Cambodia was a nation of the walking dead. The scale of the suffering was almost beyond measure. A country of roughly 8 million people had lost somewhere between 1.5 and 2.2 million in just 4 years. That is roughly 1 in every 4 Cambodians. Dead from execution, starvation, disease, forced labor, or simple neglect. The rice fields were full of bones. The rivers ran with bodies. Families had been separated, destroyed, or simply wiped out entirely. And Pol Pot was growing more paranoid by the day. He had turned against the eastern zone of Cambodia, the region nearest to Vietnam, convinced that the people there were secretly pro-Vietnamese and therefore traitors. He sent his forces to destroy entire communities in that region. Tens of thousands more were killed in these internal purges. But the Eastern Zone soldiers, rather than accept extermination, began to fight back. This is when Vietnam entered the picture directly. Vietnam and the Khmer Rouge had always had a tense relationship. Despite both being communist movements, Pol Pot deeply distrusted and despised the Vietnamese. He had been purging Cambodians with Vietnamese connections for years, and now the Khmer Rouge was actually launching raids into Vietnamese territory, burning villages, killing Vietnamese civilians. Vietnam had had enough. On December 25, 1978, Vietnam launched a massive invasion of Cambodia. A force of over 100,000 Vietnamese soldiers crossed the border. They moved fast. The Khmer Rouge, hollowed out by years of internal purges and already weakened by its war against its own people, could not stop them. On January 7, 1979, Vietnamese forces entered Phnom Penh. They found a ghost city, empty streets, abandoned buildings. The markets where thousands of people once traded were silent. But they also found something else. They found the evidence. Tuol Slung prison, the torture chambers, the photographs of the dead. The detailed records the Khmer Rouge had kept of their own atrocities. The world finally began to understand what had happened inside Cambodia. Pol Pot fled into the jungle. He refused to accept that his revolution had failed. He continued to lead the Khmer Rouge from the Thai border region for years, fighting a guerrilla war against the Vietnamese-backed government. Incredibly, the United States and China, who saw Vietnam as the greater threat, continued to provide diplomatic support to the Khmer Rouge, even after the genocide became widely known. The Khmer Rouge even retained Cambodia's seat at the United Nations until 1982. The politics of the Cold War meant that the perpetrators of one of history's worst genocides were being indirectly shielded by the world's superpowers. Justice for Pol Pot was not coming quickly, and that fact alone stands as one of the great moral failures of the late 20th century. Polted. Cambodia spent decades trying to piece itself back together from an almost total destruction. The Khmer Rouge had not just killed people, they had destroyed the very infrastructure of civilization. There were almost no teachers left because teachers had been murdered. Almost no doctors because doctors had been murdered. Almost no engineers, administrators, artists, or monks. The institutional knowledge of an entire generation had been deliberately wiped out. What remained was a traumatized population, most of whom had witnessed unimaginable horror, who now had to build schools without teachers and hospitals without doctors. The trauma passed into the next generation. Children born after the genocide grew up in families shattered by grief, silence, and unprocessed horror. Mental illness was rampant. Trust between people was broken in ways that took decades to begin healing. Even today, researchers who work in Cambodia talk about intergenerational trauma that continues to shape how people think, how families function, and how communities operate. But something changed slowly over time. The world eventually acknowledged what had happened. In 2003, after years of negotiations, a special court was established with both Cambodian and international judges to try those responsible for the genocide. It was called the Extraordinary Chambers in the Courts of Cambodia. Pol Pot himself never faced that justice. He died in April 1998 in the jungle, reportedly of heart failure. He was 72 years old. In his final interview, given to journalist Nate Thayer just months before his death, he showed no remorse. He said he had followed his conscience. He said he did not consider himself responsible for the deaths. He believed, to the end, that he had been trying to do something good. His body was cremated on a pile of trash and old tires. Some of his top lieutenants were eventually tried. Nguyen Chi, known as Brother Number 2, and Khieu Samphan, the former head of state, were convicted of genocide and crimes against humanity in 2018 and sentenced to life in prison. Both were very old men by then. Nguyen Chi died in prison in 2019. Khieu Samphan remained imprisoned. The killing fields became memorial sites. The bones of the dead were cleaned and placed in glass towers so they would not be forgotten. Tuol Sleng became a genocide museum. Every year, thousands of people walk through those halls and look at the photographs of the dead and try to make sense of what human beings are capable of doing to one another. And of whom? There is a question that historians and philosophers have wrestled with for decades when it comes to Pol Pot. How does this happen? How does a society produce a Pol Pot? How do millions of ordinary people, most of them not cruel, not hateful, not monsters, become participants in, all victims of a system so completely devoted to death? Part of the answer is ideology. When a belief system becomes so total, so absolute, that it can justify any action in service of a perfect future, it becomes capable of anything. Pol Pot did not see himself as evil. He saw himself as a surgeon, cutting out the infected parts of a sick society. The fact that the infected parts were human beings, families, children, monks, teachers, was invisible to him beneath the purity of his vision. Part of the answer is fear. The Khmer Rouge survived on fear. People informed on their neighbors not because they wanted them to die, but because they were terrified of what would happen to them if they did not. Ordinary people became instruments of a murderous system because refusal meant death, and part of the answer is the world's indifference. Cambodia was small. Cambodia was far away. The Cold War created political incentives that allowed powerful nations to look away from a genocide when looking away was convenient for them. The victims of Year Zero died not just because of Pol Pot, but because the world had better things to worry about than 2 million Cambodian peasants. That indifference should haunt us. Because the same patterns that allowed the Khmer Rouge to rise, a combination of historical trauma, foreign intervention, economic collapse, radical ideology, and the silencing of moderate voices, have appeared in other places and other times. They appear still. The bones in the glass towers at Choin Ek are not just a memorial to Cambodia's suffering. They are a warning about what happens when we let fear replace reason, when we let ideology replace human empathy, when we allow the idea of a perfect future to justify the destruction of an imperfect present. 2 million people did not die because they deserved it. They died because one man believed so completely in his vision that reality itself became the enemy. Remember them, because the only thing standing between any civilization and its own year zero is the collective decision made every single day to see other human beings as human beings, and to refuse, at any cost, to let that recognition be taken away. Um,